final session is on the Constitution and democracy, and the themes around Johnson's attacks on Parliament, the judiciary, constitutional reform, strengthening and reforming democratic institutions. And with us we've got Jolyon Maugham, Casey, the Good Law Project, and Dr. Tanzil Chowdury, if they can join us. Okay, we're going to issue a medal at the end of this to all people who stayed the whole day, okay? Okay, Tanzil, come and join us. Okay, Jolyon's going to be the first presenter. Let me just give you a quick biopic of Jolyon. He's a British barrister, founder and director of the Good Law Project, not-for-profit membership organisation that uses the law to protect the interests of the public. You'll have read the various victories that he's had through that against the government. They're fighting the case that defend, define or change the law. And the Good Law Project have challenged the culture of cronyism, the highly secretive use of billions of pounds of public funds. He's also honorary professor at the University of Durham, advised the government and the official opposition on tax policy, described by the Times as one of the country's leading barristers, actually by others as Her Majesty's loyal opposition, but there you go.
A more flattering introduction by far than I deserve. Thanks, John, for that, and also for the invitation, and to Madeline for keeping the show on the road. I'm going to take John at face value. His initial comments talked about practice as well as theory. I am a KC, but what I'm doing now really is all about the practice and not really any longer about the theory of the law. Good Law Project, which I launched in 2017, uses the law in quite an interesting way for political campaigning, essentially. We believe that in a country that doesn't have a higher law, so in the UK, almost uniquely in the world, there is no higher law against which to assess the things that Parliament does. What you can achieve by the law is pretty limited in strict legal terms. So, we fight a case on those occasions where we win. What really changes in consequence of that win answer? Often not a great deal, but the process of fighting the case can be really, really transformational. So there was a moment in late 2021 where we were arguing at great length with government and the public domain about corruption in pandemic procurement. We didn't yet have a judgment about the VIP lane. We did have judgment in another case. The other case was about the award by Dominic Cummings of a contract to his friends, as he described them, at Public First. We had a judgment at that stage. The judgment was that we had succeeded. Nobody cared about the judgment in Public First, but they cared a great deal about the case in which we had not yet had judgment about the unlawful VIP loan. So law is a very, very effective tool through which to campaign, even if, slightly weirdly, the outcome itself is not that consequential. Causality, of course, is always very difficult to unpick if you're a campaigner. I mean, you can know whether you're in the room, but you can't really know whether you made it happen. So we do try to be thoughtful, I suppose, about the impact, the real impact that we have. One metric that I do quite like, that I do attach weight to, is how much the government hates us. It's quite a good metric, actually, right? Because they really hate to breathe into your lungs the air of saliency. They do not like to do it because they know that it makes you relevant. They know that they're a centre of power, and by hating you, they are drawing attention to you and drawing support to the work that you do. And we've had some pretty enthusiastic attacks on us. So over the summer, Rishi Sunak sent out a press release in which I was named a very flattering 10 times in a single press release. Just, me with my phone. And the Daily Express badged me public enemy #1, which is also quite flattering. But there's a lot of competition, John McDonnell, for that role. And, I'm not liked any better by Suella Braverman or James Cleverly or Matt Hancock or the Hands guy, the new chair of the Conservative Party. So I think we're probably doing something right. That's a pretty good list of enemies. The attacks of us. Thank you. The attacks on us are, of course, interesting to me. And we obviously like to talk about them because it helps us fund our work. We don't have any big funders to speak of. All of the funding comes from regular, everyday people, normal members of the public who set up direct debits in our favour. So the attacks are interesting to us, but they're also interesting to those of us who care about the Constitution, because they are really part of something much, much bigger and something that is really quite worrying. They are part of a broader attack on the rule of law. So alongside the attacks on us are very frequent now attacks on lefty liberal lawyers. Those sometimes came from the mouth of Boris Johnson. You've heard that they come from the mouth of Rishi Sunak as well, and they also are uttered by his subordinates in his cabinet. But it's not just attacks on lawyers. We all remember that disgraceful Daily Mail headline that described judges as enemies of the people. Language straight out of fascist Germany. We cannot imagine that was completely coincidental. We have threats to abolish the Human Rights Act, and this all in the aftermath of our departure from the European Union, which was, until we left, the only higher law, the only mechanic by which you could assess, as a lawyer, the lawfulness of things that the government of the day wanted to do. And those attacks are succeeding. Undoubtedly, they are succeeding. Judges feel very bullied. And you can see that in all sorts of different ways. So you can hear it in anecdote. So there's a Court of Appeal judge who has been explaining that claimants are going to lose a lot of cases because judges are worried about another prorogation type event. The judge in question doesn't think that there will be another prorogation, or at least he's not anticipating that with that comment. He's saying instead that he fears another type of fascistic direct attack on parliamentary democracy, and that he is bent on conserving judicial power so that they still have it to push back if that event arises. Of course, you can kind of feel a bit sympathetic for that point of view, even if you're me. It means that you lose more cases now than you did before judges really started to get worried about what was happening. You can see it in individual decisions. So during the rows in Parliament about the Maastricht Treaty, William Rees-Mogg, who was then, I think, the editor of the Times, father of Jacob Rees-Mogg, brought a judicial review challenge against the Maastricht Treaty, and nobody questioned his right to bring that challenge. What the court said was that Lord Rees-Mogg had a sincere interest in constitutional matters, and that was good enough. Now, Good Law Project's cases are crowdfunded, and sometimes they're crowdfunded by literally tens of thousands of people. You look at the crowdfunding page, you can see how many people have donated. Sometimes the number of people who've donated are in the tens of thousands. And you would think that tens of thousands of people's sincere interest, as expressed through their dipping their hands into their pockets to fund the litigation, would count for something, but in fact, courts are now sort of applying a carte noire to good law project litigation. So they're saying, you guys cannot bring any cases at all. So we're responding to that by bringing cases through other campaigning groups. The mechanic itself is not working, but it is deeply troubling that the courts are using it. They're responding to that very explicit threat that Rishi Sunak issued last summer, that if judges did not stop Good Law Project, Parliament would close down judges. And you can also see it in statistics. So there has been, year on year, a collapse in success rates in cases involving challenges to the government, cases that lawyers call judicial review cases. They've fallen by half. So the proportion of judicial reviews that end with success for the claimant in court in 2022 is half that of 2021. Now, there are not so many candidate explanations for that precipitous decline. Either we have an astonishingly law-abiding government, or something different is happening in the courts. And, you've read, there was a very funny briefing in Politico from a government official who said, we're fucking breaking international law like it's one of our 5 a day. Of those two candidate explanations, I would suggest only one of them is plausible. Judges are frightened. And, we can talk about what's happening in Poland, we can talk about what's happening in Turkey, we can talk about what's happening in Israel, where they have very direct, explicit rule of law attacks. Ours is a very English crisis of the rule of law. It's happening, it's impactful, it's very meaningful. We're not allowed to talk about it. We don't need to talk about it because there are no constitutional safeguards in the UK to protect the independence of judges beyond this notion of the good chap. And I'll come back to that in a second, but it removes one of the very few controls, removes or weakens one of the very few controls on what Lord Hailsham described famously as our electoral dictatorship. Of course, what is happening in the courts is part of a picture with what's happening elsewhere in the functioning of our democracy. It's not an isolated attack on GLP, it's not an isolated attack on the rule of law. It's a gathering together into the hands of the executive of all of the powers. Everything that enables civil society to regard democracy as a process, as a practice, is disappearing. What we are left with instead is a 5-yearly event. So, you can look at things like the right to strike, the right to protest. I'll come back to that in a couple of minutes. The good chap predicate is the only constitutional safeguard that we have. The good chap predicate is this notion that England being exceptional and English people being good people, bad things will not be allowed to happen, and we can rely on the presence of good chaps to stop it. So what we have, so the notion goes, is a flexible, muscular constitution that protects judges from political interference. I mean, of course, the notion of a good chap itself is quite problematic. Whose definition of good? What notions of privilege, of class, are imported, and if you look at the structure of our civil service, our senior civil service, these are all people who've, walked that corridor from public schools, Oxbridge, civil service. Other people's competing notions of good really don't feature in that vision of our constitution at all. But in any event, the good chap has been defenestrated. He has been told quite clearly that his career advancement is conditional on him doing what his political masters want. And those who are ambitious get that message, and they stand out of the way when ministers tell them to do stuff, even if they know that it's wrong. So we are left really with no safeguards against a marauding executive. I mentioned the rights of protest, which are being curtailed. The free speech debate feels to me like an attack on those who want to hold power to account. It's free speech always about those without power speaking to those who have power, and yet that is denied in the account that we're given of free speech in the press. You see Henry VIII clauses in legislation, so these are legislative provisions that remove Parliament from the lawmaking process. Indeed, very often they allow ministers to overrule acts of Parliament without going back to Parliament. So again, another measure that holds power into the hands of the government of the day. You see the undermining of the devolution settlements. We'll all remember what happened when Nicola Sturgeon and the SNP very recently tried to express some solidarity with the trans community. That very, very modest measure, very modest in its impacts, was overruled by the Westminster government. And of course, we can't forget the prorogation. Now, how do we tackle that stuff? There is a real challenge, I think, for us in persuading the Labour Party of today that this stuff is real, that it's important, that it's worth investing in. There's lots that's interesting in the incipient Labour Party manifesto, but there's nothing that I can see that seeks to spread out executive power that the government of today is gathering unto itself. There's nothing about media pluralism, there's nothing about proportional representation, there's nothing to reverse the limits to the voting franchise, or indeed to expand the voting franchise as they have in Scotland to 16-year-olds. There's nothing about reversing the right to protest. All that backsliding that we've seen under this government is not being, we're not seeing reversals promised by this putative Labour government. And so you're left wondering, well, hang on a second, do these guys just want their own turn at the wheel of what is going to be a very, very powerful car? I worry about that. I really do worry about that. Now, everyone else has finished their addresses with some notes of optimism, and I have some as well. Civil society, strangely, charities, funders, employers, businesses are, I think, rather belatedly finding the courage to describe the world as it is and bear the costs of that description, rather than continuing to talk the talk of the world as it was. That carries costs for them, but they are slowly gathering together the courage to do it. And although government and media performs power in ways that are frightening and undoubtedly holds a lot of power, their grip on power is not absolute. There are lots of parts of our lives that are not touched meaningfully by government or the media. You might not have leverage over Westminster or the media, but you have agency as an employee over what your employer does. You have agency as a consumer over the people from whom you buy. You have agency as a user of public services. And these are actually the spheres in which most of us live most of our lives. They matter, and they're not owned by the media, and they're not run at an operational level by government, and they are increasingly at odds with the narrative of the world that government and the media performs. I really want to make to you a point that's very important to me. I always find it slightly depressing listening to accounts of how the world should be and not feeling as though I have any way to bring those accounts about. How am I supposed to respond to manifestos for a better world? That's always the question in my mind. What do I do? What's my agency? How can I bring that thing about? I need to have answers to those questions, otherwise I read or I hear those powerful manifestos and they depress me because I can see no way from here to there. So I always try and answer that really, really important question. You do have that leverage. You do have that leverage with your employers, the people who sell you stuff, with public services, with your local media, with your local councils. You can point out what they are getting wrong, and you can ask them to step into the breach that government is creating.
Thanks, Julian. Thank you. Right, our final presenter is Tanzil Chowdury. Tanzil's a lecturer in public law at Queen Mary University, London, and co-director for the Centre of Law and Society in a Global Context. His research focuses on war, public law, and accumulation by dispossession. He was previously at Birmingham Law School and the University of Manchester. He's also held positions in New York, Hong Kong, University, and Paris. Before beginning his job at Queen Mary, he spent a year as development worker to help set up the Greater Manchester Law Centre, was co-founder of the Northern Police Monitoring Project.
Cheers, thank you. First of all, I want to thank the organisers of this event and also for the kind invitation. It's a pleasure to be sharing this platform also with Jolyon, who's doing essential work with the Good Law Project, particularly with exposing corruption at the centre of the Tory government. Now, I should note for the audience, this is not usually the kinds of spaces I find myself in. I tend to be speaking either at academic conferences or more directly to organisers, students and social movements. So it's been interesting to think through what I'm going to discuss today. Now, with that in mind, I'm not going to deal exclusively with concrete proposals for constitutional reform. Perhaps that will come down later in whatever this forum becomes. But to discuss some of the ways in which the left have and might think about constitutionalism more broadly, and perhaps offer one or two general principles. And this might counter some of the points made by my earlier learned colleague. Now, the themes of this panel are the attacks on the institutions of the state, right? So particularly the judiciary, a case being the media attack and the former Lord Chancellor's slowness in abiding by her constitutional duty to uphold the rule of law following the Miller litigation, and Parliament, as was mentioned in the prorogation case. And we as the left can critique these critics and offer some defence of these institutions. However, I think the left can't be the ones that carte blanche defend these institutions. And I think the former Labour leader found himself, I thought, in a tricky position of defending the very institutions after the prorogation case, which have often been responsible for the slowing down or outright impediment and advance of the labour and social movements. Now, part of the reason why I think the left has found itself in this position of defending these institutions carte blanche is, one, it's symptomatic, I think, of the right's monopoly over the lexicon of anti-establishment politics, and B, the general antipathy or lack of imagination of the left when it comes to constitutional matters. Now, in my own work, I've fallen on the side that constitutions and constitutionalisms mediate and reconstitute social antagonism in particular ways. I'm not going to go into detail of that here. But given that, I don't think it will ever be the emancipatory vehicle that we as the left want it to be. However, that doesn't mean that the left should ignore it, and often it has ignored it to its detriment. This has, of course, never always been the case. Social historians, left social scientists, left public lawyers have offered interesting critiques and reforms of the UK Constitution. We can think of John Griffith's work, firmly in that political constitutionalist tradition synonymous with LSE public lawyers, on the politics of the judiciary, or indeed Christopher Hill's materialist reading of the so-called English Revolution, in which the modern parliament emerges at a time when there is a decaying feudal aristocracy and an emergent bourgeois class. Of course, Beatrice and Sidney Webb's Constitution for a Socialist Commonwealth imagines, among other things, a social and political parliament, the latter that would be responsible for legislating on labour, health, education, the control of industry and intergenerational justice, the former dealing with defence, justice and foreign affairs. More contemporarily, there has been a resurgence in Marxist and materialist approaches to understanding the Constitution. In particular, I'm thinking of the work of Mike Wilkinson and Marco Goldoni, drawing off the work of 20th century German and Italian writers. Imagine what they call the material constitution. So we have the formal constitution. What I teach my first year students are the sources of the UK Constitution: Acts of Parliament, common law, constitutional conventions and international treaties. But to understand the formal constitution is only grasped by properly dealing with the deeper societal context. And so they identify four layers of the constitution: political unity, institutions, social relations, and political objectives, which make up the ordering forces of the Constitution. Now, this reading of the Constitution also broadens out the category of constitutional actors, not just to politicians and judges, but to those that push and move the Constitution, and that includes social and labour movements. Keith Ewing, in a paper entitled Socialism and Constitution, argues that, quote, the left should restore the Constitution's social democratic base by identifying ways to empower Parliament, people and government, developing a new theory of legality, all set against this idea of a liberal constitution. There have also been important criticisms of judicial power, or juridification, or juristocracy, which, in a nutshell, describes the phenomena of rule by courts, the growing power of domestic and transnational courts across the world, defenestrating the power of democratically elected legislative chambers. Though judicial power is, I think mistakenly, attributed with the right, there have been important and compelling criticisms from the left about how judicial power locks in neoliberalism, immunising it from the quote-unquote dangers of democratic parliaments. Or finally, we might think about what Professor Thomas Poole referred to in a blog in the London Review of Books as executive power, which is this engorging of the executive with the kind of corollary erosion of judicial and parliamentary accountability. Now, capitalism presupposes a separation between the political state and the economy. Under capitalism, therefore, the economy is presumed to be governed by market relations, and the only role of the state in the market economy is to prop up or regulate the market. So we have to think as the left about how constitutional law maintains the rationale of the separation of the political state and the economy. Now, this separation, of course, was not always the case. In feudalism, the political and economic state were fused, but more contemporarily, in the settlement between capital and labour post the Second World War, captured by Keynesianism, the state intervened in the economy to regulate wages, ensure full employment and protect trade union power. What, therefore, might a left or a socialist constitutionalism look like? This is where I'm going to offer some very general principles of reform. I'm not going to take too much time. So the US law professor Willie Forbath describes socialist constitutionalism as the extension of democracy and democratic institutions into economic life. It is about the redistribution of power and authority, and not simply the redistribution of wealth and goods, the distribution of power between labour and capital, which I think has been detailed by my colleagues earlier on in this policy forum. So rather than the reforms that Labour and the left have made to redistribute power between central and local government, we might want to think about that as well as redistributing power between capital and labour. So socialist constitutionalism, or a left constitutionalism, isn't just about redistributing resources, but it's about democratising those spaces where we produce value, but also spaces of social reproduction. So we might think about democratising workplaces, but also housing projects, schools, transport and health provision. In other words, socialist constitutionalism, or a left constitutionalism, is about mass democratisation. A left constitution has to, among other things, focus on democratising production and social reproduction. As Ewing writes in the paper I mentioned earlier on, the key purpose of a left-leaning constitutionalism is to empower rather than restrain people, Parliament and the government. Now, this is not just about enshrining rights in a nascent, codified and entrenched constitution, important though that may seem. This has often failed. For example, transformative constitutionalism sought to enact massive social reform through enshrining not just civil and political rights, but also economic, social and cultural ones, developing styles of legal adjudication to complement this programme. South Africa, post-apartheid, was its beacon of transformative constitutionalism. But most people would argue that this was largely considered a failure, largely due to the forces of global capital. And we can also look at the constitution of Bangladesh. Now, you might not think that the constitution of Bangladesh would in any way be progressive or revolutionary, but in the constitution of Bangladesh, it refers to socialism and freedom from exploitation, the emancipation of workers and peasants as a constitutional principle. And yet, garment workers in special economic zones have characterised the country as a world sweatshop for clothes made for Western markets. Social democracy or democratic socialism or left socialism cannot be created purely by progressive rights, but has to be sustained by progressive economics and progressive politics. And this is the key point. Constitutionalism can't do the transformative work the left wants it to do. There needs to be a mass political movement that forces the constitution to do that work, and, importantly, a constitution that allows it to do that. Again, quoting Ewing, for social democrats, or we could say socialists or democratic socialists, constitutions are about enabling rather than restraining. It's purely instrumental. Now, these things are outside the realm of possibility. In the 1920s, there was a Ministry of Labour which played an important role in securing trade union representation in government and an important part in extending trade union influence in rulemaking in industry and enterprises. It was abandoned in 1997, but as I understand it, there was a version of it in the 2019 manifesto. But there needs to be imagination of the structures of state power that empower workers, social movements. And some left constitutional thinkers are doing that. The first one that comes to mind is a book I read from a Chilean political theorist called Camilla Vergara, who aims at institutionalizing plebeian power as supreme authority within a mixed constitutional structure. So she kind of borrows from kind of neo-Republican thought, Marxism, Machiavelli, all these kinds of interesting sources to really imagine institutions of the state in which people are considered the kind of trump, the supreme power. Now this is, and I'll finish on this is just dipping our toes into developing some principles. We ignore broader questions about the creation of a mass political movement and the force, and that forces this constitution to do what it wants. And imagine these new democratic structures would look like. There needs to also be a question about the nature of legality, the role of the courts, the place of parliament. That includes the monarch too. But the left ignores issues of state and constitutional structure to its peril. And for there to be a socialisation of the means of production or commoning of the means of production, there needs to be a socialisation of the institutions of the state. Thank you very much.
Questions, comments? We'll start from this side this time and then go along. Yep. Oh, whoa, all right. It completely overturned the constitutional niceties of this meeting. We'll start over here then, to the right. Just down here. Yes, please, if you could.
Oh, the pressure. First of all, thank you, both of you. Jolyon especially. I'm an ex-barrister, also obviously quite left-wing, so thank you for representing us in an otherwise reasonably problematic profession, and for all the amazing work that the Good Law Project does. I'm probably going to annoy you now by saying I thought your points about the independence of the judiciary being under threat and the separation of powers being under threat is obviously so important in terms of our constitutional arrangements and the stability of the country. However, if you are very pro-democracy, what are the prospects of the judiciary fighting back in terms of maintaining their independence? And potentially, if we're looking at leaving the ECHR and repealing the Human Rights Act, if the Tories get their way in the next few years, do you think there's any prospect that the judiciary would do something like expand the grounds of judicial review to protect common law human rights, or do anything in that sphere to make sure that the government can't trample all over us, effectively? And Dr. Chowdury, as also a QM graduate, thanks. Great representation, amazing presentation. I had a really good question until you made the really obvious point that democracy is naturally a good thing and maybe the judiciary having too much power is not a good idea. However, do you think there's any role at all if we go for a kind of leftist, socialist constitution for an independent judiciary that holds the executive to account in sort of any capacity, despite the fact that that's obviously in opposition to democratic principles? Thank you.
Right. Hilary, behind you, this right-wing block here is just taken.
Cheeky. Okay, so my name's Hilary Wainwright. I'm co-editor of Red Pepper magazine. Oh, okay. Anyway, so, but what I wanted to, it was really, every speech here has been brilliant, and well done for John for challenging us to sit, you know, to be here all day and to be so intensely engaged. So, anyway, but I wanted to take up Tanzil's challenge of a socialist constitution and ask, I mean, it relates to all the other sessions which have stressed democratization of economic strategy, decentralization, and think, what does empowerment mean institutionally? I mean, we've got to start from a recognition that the Labour Party, including its very being, its very organisation, is sort of complicit with our liberal constitution. In a way, it's that very separation between the political and the trade union, the industrial and the political, is a sort of reflection, a mirror image of the liberal separation between economics and politics. So you've always had that delegation of politics to the parliamentary sphere by the unions. And in a way, that goes completely contrary to any idea of the unions playing a crucial role in industrial strategy. I mean, Alfredo talked about the destruction of the collective, and the one remaining place where there is a collective consciousness is in the unions. And that makes them very open to thinking of themselves not just as workers, but as citizens, and very responsive to collective action by social movements. So we saw in the late 70s the Lucas Aerospace alternative. We saw in the pandemic workers in Airbus converting their factory to making ventilators. And it was the workers that led that, not some, declaration from Boris Johnson. Now, in terms of political institutions that could reflect that and that actually enable unions to express political power rather than delegating it to the parliamentary party. I mean, we've seen elements, glimpses of that in the local governments of Brazil, the Porto Alegre sort of idea, where there was basically a sharing of power between the elected government, the PT, and popular movements. And we saw it a little bit in the GLC with the Popular Planning Unit, but also other parts of the GLC that genuinely shared power, allocated resources, not to meet needs that were decided by the GLC, but to give resources to social movements. Now, how could that be generalized institutionally? I mean, so that it's not the South African constitution obviously was, you could see why it was an ideal, but it was based, as you say, on rights, not really on empowerment. And is empowerment, has it got to be local? So is it about a whole sort of devolution strategy so that the Prestons of this world had real resources? Or is there any other way in which that idea of sharing power with civil society could be institutionalized? And certainly, maybe this is a question for John, it would imply a very different kind of Labour Party and a very different kind of trade union movement where politics wasn't delegated to Parliament, but where the unions themselves became political in the sense of taking on the issues of public good. So it would mean a shift in collective bargaining to be collective bargaining about use value, about the social needs of society, the public good, and not just about profits and exchange value.
Thanks. Just pass them back into this right block.
Okay. It's the left wing block. Right. I'm left on this side, yeah. I'm Thelma Walker. I'm a former Labour MP, former head teacher, and just, I suppose, a left-wing nuisance now, really. That's what I get up to. I cause bother. Just a very, very straightforward question about democracy and about the people. Because today is about policy. It's about changing lives. It's about what we value and who we value. And for me, what's really important to know that over 15 million people use their democratic right not to vote at the last GE. And my question is, we've talked about agency, but if we don't have those policies that are going to address the challenges, the horror that many ordinary people face on a day-to-day basis, how on earth, my question is, do we engage with those people who feel disengaged, who feel that nobody is speaking for them? So it's just a simple question. How do we get those 15 million to believe that somebody is going to change their life and change society? Thank you.
Tell me the woman, I've just...
Hello, I'm Imogen. It's been a delight, really splendid. Thank you very much, John, for organising this. And it has fed me with some resources of hope, as Raymond Williams gave us the model of. I think that we have been savaged in the last couple of years, and hope is the thing that has been diminished most profoundly. And I think that it is part of the answer to your question, is that the lack of hope has lost a lot of our base in terms of us being able to engage and build our movement. And that was that kept us going at the time and gave all these great ideas. There are loads of brilliant policies. There's a big gap, which I've noticed today, which I don't know if anyone else has noticed, that I feel like housing has been really a side thing that's been mentioned very in passing, when I believe that the housing crisis is absolutely at the core of our cost of living crisis, of our energy crisis, of our whole the whole destruction of our services and everything, and the idea of getting an increase in wages by success in the industrial negotiations, only for it to all go to your fucking landlord, is just ridiculous. So we need to address the housing crisis, and we need some serious joined up policy about housing, about social housing, about council housing. The social housing association sector has been completely ravaged in the same way as the schools have been ravaged by private sector. And we need to claim back the social housing sector. And in order to build our movement, those who have a voice must not be gatekeepers. We must open doors where anybody who has any platform should open doors to other people and not deny people entrance. So we need to all open the corridors to power.
The gentleman, did you want to come in? Yes, yeah, this gentleman.
Well, thank you very much for organising the conference, and my congratulations to all the speakers covering so much ground. One of the things that disturbs me on the Labour side, for example, you Mr. MacDonald, had said that you'd like to abolish the House of Lords. Keir Starmer said, in fact, he would like to make it an elected chamber. If you made it an elected chamber, I'm sorry to say this, you're a notable exception. The House of Commons is regarded generally as a mediocre chamber full of mediocrities. At least what you can say in favour of the upper chamber is at least it's regarded, in fact, as a house of correcting or criticism of policies made in the lower house. Unfortunately, the House of Lords seems to be corrupted, I think that is the word, with cronies and donors, in fact, to the Conservative Party. That can be changed if you have a committee and you deprive prime ministers from nominating, in fact, people and the dissolutions. But I would be sorry to see the House of Lords go, at least if you have judges in it, which you have at the moment. I think there is a chance, in fact, of democracy surviving.
Thanks. I'm only going to bring in people who haven't spoken so far, and there's a couple here. I'm going to try and finish relatively on time, okay? This guy, and then the two others, and then that's it, okay? And there's time for people to respond. People can be brief in their contributions.
Thanks, Dave Dewhurst, New Putney Debates and various things. With regards to constitution, democracy and the law, I've been involved on the edge of the middle of various legal cases of people occupying land, seeking access to land over the last 12 years. And what strikes me a great deal is how the law has worsened over the last decade and a half, with mob-handed legal teams of barristers supported by very rich people whittling away and changing case law from Occupy London to Runnymede to Grow Heathrow and so on. And I'm interested in how you intend to address that, because constitution, land is underneath everything else. We mentioned it there. I was on Dartmoor 2 or 3 weeks ago. Our rights to these resources have been stolen from us for centuries, and we need to find a way back and a way taking it. And part of it is to make this more effective by when you go away, and okay, none of us have very great child caring responsibilities here, probably at the moment, but talking to people that we don't want to talk to and probably don't want to talk to us, and so that we can clarify in our minds all this stuff which introductory psychology told me we're going to forget 70% of it in 48 hours if you don't review it.
Thanks a lot. There's two people, one standing up now, the guy directly behind you, because you've indicated for quite a long while, and then that'll be it.
I had a question specifically for Jolie, and although thank you to all the speakers for today. If you had some insights into the way that the courts are now dealing with protests as well. You say that the Parliament's undermining our right to protest, but also in the courts they're being extremely punitive with the way they're dealing with protests. I myself received a 4-month sentence for my involvement in Interstate Britain. I spent 2 months in HMP Thameside. Also in ongoing criminal trials that I've had and many other people have had, the decisions are extremely punitive. So like the rulings are that all of our legal defences haven't been allowed. We haven't been able to talk about climate change, fuel poverty, our motivations, moral obligation. Any of that hasn't been allowed. Last week somebody did breach that ruling, and he was also given a 2-month sentence for breaching the ruling. And so I just wonder if it's like from parliamentary pressure, or if that's also from the court system, that they are also very extremely hostile to the new kind of wave of protesting that's happening.
Scandal.
Hello everyone, my name is Dodo. It's a pleasure to be here with you all. In 2008, the financial crash happened. 3 years later, Occupy happened. It wasn't until 2015 and 2016 that the Bernie Sanders and Corbyn movement happened. It seems to me the cost of living crisis might be a bigger shock to the system than the financial crisis. This means that we are only at the start of the political ripple from such a hit to the system. I believe the left is stronger than it's ever been, and the potential for a left movement is there more than it has ever been. And that is why I think we cannot walk away from the electoral system, and we cannot leave an undemocratic Labour Party to solve our solutions. I think there is the opportunity for a new left project that can be bigger and wider than the Corbyn project, and that this wave will inevitably come if we think about it in the right way. So I really think that we need not feel as if we had been defeated, because all our arguments are being validated, and the movement, our ideas are shifting so quickly at the moment. People who would never 2 years ago argue for a land value tax or rent controls are arguing for them now. There is so much space, and I think that the one thing holding us back is if we continue to operate through a first-past-the-post system that is undemocratic and will not give us representation, and a Labour Party that will, if we stay embedded in the Labour Party with all our movements, is very, very good at suppressing force. It is excellent due to its structure of making sure it contain all our attempts to influence it. So what I say now is I think we need to start thinking about what the next political project will look like, what its democratic structure will be, and what its internal system of justice will be, so we don't get attacked and demoralized in the same way we did last time. Thank you very much.
I knew the last speaker would get me expelled from the Labour Party, but there you are.
Thank you, John. So the woman in the green striped jumper on the right asked whether there was prospects of the judiciary fighting back. I mean, the data is not encouraging. The Supreme Court is very, very small c conservative. The High Court is in rapid retrenchment. But we do also need to remember the prorogation case, where most orthodox legal analysis said that the prorogation would be upheld in the courts. My view, and I'm not a grown-up constitutional lawyer, but my view was that so appalling was the attack on democracy that the courts would not allow it to be upheld, that it would be overturned. And my view, as it turned out, was proven right. So I do still believe in the idea of judges as a sort of final safety net for democracy. Hilary Wainwright asked about sharing power and how we influence central government. And I suppose I just want to push back very gently at that. I don't think there is only one pie that has to be shared. I think it's a bit demoralising to think of central government, powerful though it is, as being the only centre of power. I think there are other centres of power as well, and I think they're important, and I think we can influence them. Ms. Walker talked about how do you encourage people to vote. I mean, Tony Blair's third government was won with only 35% of the electorate, strikingly. And, you know, it's no secret that my own sort of political awakening has happened rather later in my life than I would have wished. And certainly I wasn't always a friend to John and Jeremy when they were in opposition. But, you know, great credit to them for engaging people who a sort of more conservative Labour Party would not. Imogen asked about the lack of hope, losing lots of our base. I mean, I think Tanzil made this point really well. Economics is not an area where the law is powerful. Lawyers don't tend to bring cases about socio-economic rights because there are no socio-economic rights, really, that are known to lawyers. I mean, that's just the truth, right? There is no active provision in the Equality Act that protects against economic and social disadvantage. There is a provision on the statute books, but it hasn't been commenced. We're actually writing to government about that at the moment, and we hope we might be able to bring a challenge about that, but as things stand, there are no general socio and economic rights. Even if there were, it would be difficult to feel optimistic about what they would achieve, because having rights on the statute book is all well and good, but you actually need lawyers to access them, and there is no legal aid to speak of anymore. What point is it in having those rights if they're not accessible to anyone? And the blue jumper on the left made a very similar point about how the law has worsened. And I have to agree with you. You know, this notion that is represented by Lady Justice sort of standing proudly atop the Old Bailey, you know, holding her scales. Usually she wears a blindfold. I don't think she does for the Old Bailey. It's a kind of gaslighting, really. What is increasingly the truth is that only the wealthy can access the law, and because only the wealthy can access the law becomes a tool by which the wealthy oppress those without. So the effect of the law is precisely the opposite, unsurprisingly, of what we are told that it is. I feel quite strongly about that, and I mean, I'll announce later in the week a project to tackle that. I mean, man on the my extreme left, at the back, talked about what's happening to protesters, and you thanked me for the work that Good Law Project does. Well, I want to thank you for your bravery in protesting about things. I want to thank you for your bravery protesting things that are of existential importance to all of us, and making a really, really important sacrifice. And I pray that you'll continue feeling able to make that sacrifice, and I pray also that you'll inspire others to make that sacrifice as well. I mean, anything else that I might say is really kind of secondary or tertiary to that. What the magistrates' courts are doing is wrong. I mean, if you look, you'll see earlier today I tweeted out a request for a briefing note that I understand has been given to Westminster Mags and the City of London Mags, who I understand are dealing with most, certainly XR protesters. We have gossip, well-informed gossip, that they've been given a briefing note. The briefing note is unlawful. We're very keen to get our hands on it. If anyone has a respectable relative, unlike the rabble gathered here today, who might be a magistrate, who might drop us a copy, we'd very much like to see it. You know, and Tanzil made these points much better than I will.
I'll just kind of briefly respond. So the question about like how to engage more people to vote. I think they've got to believe that voting is going to change things. So I think until that, I mean, we were maybe close to that in 2017, 2019. I was always really reluctant to vote for the Labour Party, but when, you know, Jeremy Corbyn apologised for the Iraq War on the day of the publication of the Shilcott inquiry, and then the manifesto was produced, it seemed as if voting might be able to do something. So, I mean, I don't know if it's... I think people should absolutely exercise their right to vote, but there's got to be something meaningful and transformational for them to vote for. Are there any what role might the court have in a kind of left constitutionalism? They absolutely have a role. I mean, there is a school of thought within kind of Marxist jurisprudence which would say that the law would wither away. This was, and they're, you know, by extension, the courts. But I mean, you know, I don't want to kind of intellectualise that. I think that the role of the courts would be to kind of green light the kind of political programme of a government that would be oriented around social democracy, socialism. You know, this is what you had in terms of the way in which judicial review operated in the 40s and 50s, what we public lawyers called the kind of green light theory of judicial review, which was very much like government has a programme and we have to make sure the courts have to facilitate that in some way. Whereas in you know, much later, when you have a passed back state, a state which is less engaged in providing welfare provision, then the courts have a different role vis-a-vis the government. So, I mean, these are things I think that we've got to think about as the left. What does empowerment mean? I mean, I guess, like, I think we talked about the experimentation with kind of municipal socialism. I think we can learn from that. I think, you know, albeit it's outdated, and I don't want to romanticise the past, but this Ministry of Labour that was established in the 1920s was really, really interesting because it kind of gave a representation of the trade unions, of their representative institutions in government, in policy development, and therefore in rulemaking. At one point, they represented around about 85% of the workforce. So these are the kinds of things where, you know, labour, social movements are represented in the institutions of government that we've got to think about. One last thing that I would say is, you know, I mentioned that the Constitution isn't just a formal document. It's not just the institutions of the state, but it's also about the social movements and labour movement that force the Constitution to move. You know, that get Joe and the Good Law Project and whoever else to do the work that they do. And, you know, if you look at any moment in the UK's constitutional history, it's always been preceded by some kind of social antagonism, right? between either capital or labour or between fractions of capital. You saw that with the Parliament Acts, right? These were acts of Parliament which were created by rational constitutional actors. There was antagonism between kind of the force of capital that represented laissez-faire capitalism and this kind of emerging welfare capitalism, which is what the Liberal government wanted to introduce but was thwarted by the House of Lords. You had it with the tax credit crisis, right? You had it with the Acts of Union. You know, people don't know that there was a referendum on actually Scotland seceding from the Union only a couple of years after 1707 or 1710 when the Act of Union was made, because of a malt tax that was introduced by Westminster Parliament, which and there were riots in Scotland as a result of it because a lot of workers were going to be harmed. These moments in our constitutional history, these shifts, Brexit is one of them. Doesn't happen because of judges and politicians. They're part of the story, but it's because of social movements. It's because of social forces that push these kinds of things along. So we also have to empower those forces. So when we look at acts of Parliament that are trying to curtail the rights of protest, that are trying to smash the ability of trade unions to organise and to strike and to withdraw their labour, that is also an attack on our Constitution, right? The Constitution isn't just something that judges and politicians do. It's something that we do as organised labour and as social movements.
Can I thank Julian and Tanzil for the session that they came to. In closing now, just 3 or 4 sentences on what happens next. And the purpose of this was just to get people together again that we hadn't seen for quite a while, working in all the different fields and campaigning as well. And we're, to be honest, we're overwhelmed. In fact, we begin to panic this morning at just how many of you turned up because of the space that's available. I'm absolutely amazed that so many of you have stayed as well all day. It's terrific. The other element was just we're trying to raise the level of political debate and discussion again. There's a bit of a vacuum and vacuousness that, in terms of the discussions that are taken, and that's not a criticism of anyone, that's just what it is at the moment. And so the idea is to just get people together, meet up, use it as a contribution to start raising the level of political debate with significant briefings, etc., just to explain what's going on. We'll publish as much as we can online through on the Claim the Future website and the ICOP website of the presentations themselves. The other objective, the Labour Party is now starting its consultation on the development of its manifesto. People will go back to their formal organisations, their constituencies, their affiliates, and submit to that consultation. So anything around informing and raising, again, the quality of those submissions, of course, we want to aim for. But the other thing as well is just, if Labour does win the election, which I'm desperately hoping it does, my big fear is it wins and then nothing significant emerges from it. So what we've got to do is give people the confidence that when they go into government, there is a range of alternatives that are readily implementable and actually could be transformative. So it's not in any challenging way, it's in a way in which actually it's about constructively saying you can do it, and here's a range of things that you should be looking at of how you can do it. Because the desperate need that there is in our society at the moment is there, and it's building, it's not going away, and it isn't just the cost of living crisis. It's the assault on basic human rights as well. It's the assault on respect and dignity of people, as we've seen from some of the evidence today. So that's what the purpose of this was all about. With ICOP, what we're also doing, in addition to the briefing of MPs, etc., ages ago, some of you may remember, I did this People's Parliament series about 7 or 8 years ago, where once a month I'd organise someone to come along and talk about an idea. Usually it was about their new book or something like that, whatever. But they were packed down. It did work, and actually it stimulated some of the discussions that we had that eventually led into the discussions of the manifestos that we had. We're going to relaunch that under what we're calling the New Thinking series. One of those is going to be with Guy Standing, who's just produced a book. We worked with him on the commons, if you like. He's just produced a book on the commons of the oceans. And the event in Parliament then is on the 27th of March. It's a Monday. It'll be in the evening. And with the idea of that is someone comes along, presents their ideas, and there's a discussion. But again, it's all part of just raising the level of political debate and also inspiring people in a lot of the ways that these ideas that can. This wasn't about launching a new project. Can someone note this as evidence? This wasn't about launching a new project or a new party or anything like that. It was purely and simply allowing people to come along, listen to some ideas, discuss them and debate them, and hoping it inspired people. I hope it did, and thanks for coming along. Okay. Thank you.